I stood in the middle of the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, champagne flute trembling in my hand, watching my husband of 4 years slow dance with his ex-girlfriend for the seventh time that evening. The crystal chandeliers above cast prismatic light across the polished marble floors, illuminating the 300 guests who pretended not to notice the spectacle unfolding before them, though their sidelong glances and barely concealed whispers told a different story entirely. Natasha Sinclair had her manicured fingers laced behind Marcus's neck, her crimson dress pressed against his charcoal suit. Her platinum blonde head tilted back as she laughed at something he'd said, something apparently so amusing that he'd thrown his head back in matching laughter, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife stood alone by the bar. Slowly dying inside with each passing measure of the orchestra's rendition of The Way You Look Tonight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 6 hours to when this evening started with such different promise. That morning, I'd woken in our brownstone in Brooklyn Heights with genuine excitement fluttering in my chest. My cousin Vivienne's annual charity gala was always the social event of the season, and this year marked a special occasion, the 10th anniversary of her foundation supporting arts education in underserved communities. As an art curator at the modest but respected Thornton Gallery in Chelsea, I felt particularly connected to this cause. I'd spent weeks selecting the perfect gown, a midnight blue silk creation that hugged my curves without being ostentatious, elegant without screaming for attention. That was always my style, understated, classic, refined. Marcus had been distracted during breakfast, scrolling through his phone while his coffee went cold. His real estate development firm was in the middle of securing financing for a major project in Long Island City, and the stress had been showing in the tight set of his shoulders, the distant look in his green eyes. "You're still planning to come tonight, right?" I'd asked, keeping my tone light though my fingers had tightened around my own coffee cup. "Of course," he'd said, not looking up. "I wouldn't miss Vivienne's thing. What time do we need to leave?" Thing wasn't exactly how I'd describe an event that required 6 months of planning and a guest list that read like a who's who of New York society. But I'd let it slide. Marcus had never quite understood the world I'd come from. I deliberately stepped away from when I chose to build my own career, rather than slide into a predetermined role in my family's empire. Most people who knew me as Claire Hartman, art curator, had no idea that I was also Claire Hartman of the Hartman International Hotel Group. My grandfather had built the business from a single boutique hotel in Manhattan into a global luxury brand spanning 47 properties across 6 continents. My father now ran the empire, my older brother was being groomed to take over, and my younger sister managed the company's philanthropic foundation. I'd been expected to join the family business, perhaps overseeing the art collections in our properties, but I'd wanted something of my own. Something I'd earned through my own merit, my own expertise, my own sweat. When I'd met Marcus 5 years ago at a gallery opening in Soho, he'd known me simply as Claire, a woman with good taste and a passion for contemporary sculpture. Our courtship had been wonderfully normal. Dinner at neighborhood restaurants, weekend trips to the Berkshires, long conversations about art and architecture, and our dreams for the future. By the time he'd met my family, we were already engaged, and while the revelation of my background had shocked him, he'd assured me it didn't change anything between us. He loved me for me, he'd said, not for my family name or fortune. I'd believed him. God, how I'd believed him. That evening, I'd emerged from our bedroom to find Marcus already dressed, looking devastatingly handsome in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He'd turned when he heard my heels on the hardwood floor, and for a moment, his expression had held genuine appreciation. "You look beautiful," he'd said, and I'd felt a warm flush of pleasure. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself," I'd replied, smoothing the lapels of his jacket, breathing in his familiar cologne, bergamot and cedar. The car service had arrived promptly at 6, giving us plenty of time to reach the Meridian Hotel before cocktail hour ended. During the drive through Manhattan, Marcus had been on his phone again, firing off emails to his business partner. I'd watched the city lights blur past the window, mentally reviewing the guest list Vivienne had shared with me. Celebrities, philanthropists, old money families, new tech billionaires. It was going to be quite the crowd. What I hadn't known, what Vivienne apparently hadn't known, was that one of her co-chairs had added several names to the guest list at the last minute, including Natasha Sinclair. We'd arrived at the Meridian just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The hotel's facade gleamed with thousands of tiny lights, and a red carpet stretched from the curb to the entrance, lined with photographers capturing arrivals. As a member of the Hartman family, I could have mentioned that we actually own the Meridian, along with 17 other properties in the tri-state area, but that wasn't information I casually shared. Tonight, I was simply another guest, albeit one whose cousin was hosting. The grand ballroom took my breath away, as it always did. Vivienne had outdone herself with the decorations, thousands of white roses interspersed with dramatic calla lilies, gold-rimmed chargers at each place setting, and ice sculptures depicting various art forms positioned throughout the space. A 12-piece orchestra occupied the stage, filling the room with sophisticated jazz standards. Cocktail servers circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more per bite than most people spent on an entire meal. "Claire, darling," Vivienne had swept toward us in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and champagne-colored silk, air-kissing both my cheeks. "You look absolutely stunning. And Marcus, so good to see you." "Vivienne, this is incredible." Natasha Sinclair stood near the bar, poured into a red dress that left little to the imagination. Her signature platinum hair swept up in an elaborate updo that probably required an entire team of stylists. She'd been Marcus's girlfriend before me, a relationship that had ended badly, according to the sparse details Marcus had shared. He described her as high-maintenance and drama-prone, and I'd been content to leave it at that, secure in the knowledge that he'd chosen me instead. But watching her scan the crowd with predatory focus, I'd felt an uncomfortable prickle of unease. That prickle had intensified when her gaze had landed on Marcus at the bar, and her glossed lips had curved into a smile that could only be described as calculated. "Is that Natasha Sinclair?" I'd asked Vivienne quietly. My cousin had followed my gaze and grimaced. Yes. Jennifer from the Arts Council added her at the last minute. Apparently she made a sizable donation to secure a seat." "I'm sorry, Claire. I had no idea about her history with Marcus until you mentioned it months ago, and by then the invitation was already sent." "It's fine," I'd said automatically, though my stomach had begun to knot. Ancient history, right? If only I'd known how the evening would unfold, I might have left right then. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight, and at that moment, I'd still believed in the fundamental security of my marriage. Marcus had returned with our drinks, a gin martini for him, champagne for me, and we'd mingled with other guests. I'd introduced him to several important collectors and potential clients for his business, playing the role of supportive wife with practiced ease. He'd seemed relaxed, laughing at appropriate moments, making intelligent conversation about the art market and urban development trends. Then Natasha had materialized beside us, as if summoned by some malevolent force. "Marcus." "Oh my God, I had no idea you'd be here." Her voice had that particular pitch that some women use when they want to sound surprised and delighted, though her extensive makeup and strategic positioning suggested this encounter was anything but accidental. "Natasha." Marcus's voice had been carefully neutral, but I'd noticed the way his posture had shifted, becoming slightly defensive. "Yeah, Claire's cousin is hosting the event." "Claire, of course. How wonderful to finally meet you." Natasha had extended a hand tipped with crimson nails that matched her dress exactly. Her grip had been firm, almost aggressive, and her smile hadn't reached her ice-blue eyes. "Marcus has told me absolutely nothing about you, which I suppose is understandable given our history." I'd returned her smile with one equally insincere. "Nice to meet you, Natasha. Marcus has mentioned you were involved with the Arts Council. How wonderful that you're supporting such an important cause." "Well, education is so vital," she'd purred, though her attention had already shifted back to Marcus. "Marcus, you look incredible. Real estate must be treating you well. Are you still working on that waterfront project you always dreamed about?" That's when I'd realized she'd done her homework. The waterfront project wasn't public knowledge yet. Marcus's firm was still in negotiations. Either she'd been following his career closely, or she'd deliberately researched him before tonight. Marcus had launched into an explanation of the project, his enthusiasm overriding what should have been caution about discussing confidential business matters. Natasha had hung on every word, touching his arm for emphasis, leaning in close, creating a bubble of intimacy that excluded me despite my physical presence. I'd excused myself to check on the seating arrangements, and when I'd returned 15 minutes later, they'd still been deep in conversation. Marcus had been laughing at something Natasha had said, his hand on the small of her back in a gesture that looked far too comfortable, too familiar. Dinner had been assigned seating, and mercifully, Natasha had been placed at a different table. I'd sat beside Marcus, making conversation with the venture capitalist on my other side while picking at my Chilean sea bass. Across the table, a prominent gallery owner I'd worked with had recognized me, and we'd discussed an upcoming exhibition. But I'd been distracted, my attention repeatedly drawn to where Natasha sat 3 tables away, her gaze fixed on Marcus with unsettling intensity. After dinner, as servers cleared dessert plates and the orchestra resumed playing, couples had begun moving toward the dance floor. Marcus had been checking his phone again when Natasha had appeared at our table. "Marcus, you promised me a dance, remember? From that charity event 2 years ago when you had to leave early." Her voice had been light, playful, but there'd been steel underneath. I'd waited for Marcus to politely decline, to say he'd promised the first dance to his wife. Instead, he'd glanced at me quickly, so quickly I'd almost missed it, and said, "Sure, one dance won't hurt." That first dance had stretched into a second, then a third. By the fourth, I'd stopped counting and started drinking champagne faster than was advisable. The venture capitalist's wife had touched my arm gently. "Are you all right, dear?" "Perfectly fine," I'd lied, watching Marcus dip Natasha during a tango. When had my husband become such a confident dancer? We'd barely danced at our own wedding. Other guests had begun to notice. I'd caught the pitying glances, the whispered conversations behind raised hands. Caroline Weatherby, an old acquaintance from my boarding school days, had approached me with barely concealed glee masquerading as concern. "Claire, darling, is everything okay? Your husband seems quite friendly with Natasha Sinclair." "They're old friends," I'd said, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning through my veins. "Just catching up." "Oh yes, of course." Caroline's tone had suggested she thought nothing of the sort. I'd finally approached the dance floor, weaving between couples until I'd reached Marcus and Natasha. They'd been locked in a slow dance to Unforgettable, their bodies pressed together in a way that was decidedly inappropriate for a married man and his ex-girlfriend. "Marcus," I'd said quietly, touching his shoulder, "would you like to dance with your wife?" He'd barely glanced at me. "In a minute, Claire, Natasha and I are in the middle of catching up." Those words had landed like a physical blow. In a minute. As if I were an interruption, an inconvenience, someone who could wait while he indulged in nostalgia with the woman who came before me. Natasha had smirked over his shoulder, her eyes meeting mine with unconcealed triumph. That look had communicated everything. "I can take him any time I want. He was mine first. You're just keeping him warm for me." I'd retreated to the bar, my cheeks burning with shame and anger. The bartender had taken one look at my face and poured me a generous glass of champagne without being asked. "Rough night?" he'd asked kindly. "You have no idea," I'd murmured. That's when something inside me had shifted. I'd spent my entire adult life being accommodating, understanding, the cool-headed curator who never made scenes. I'd walked away from my family's wealth and influence to prove I could succeed on my own merits. I'd supported Marcus's career ambitions, introduced him to valuable contacts, played the perfect wife at business dinners and networking events. And here I stood, publicly humiliated at my own cousin's gala, watching my husband dance the night away with his ex-girlfriend, while 300 of New York's social... The old Claire, the one who'd been raised to maintain composure at all costs, to never make a scene, to handle conflicts with quiet dignity, would have left silently, addressed the situation privately at home, perhaps cried in the bathroom where no one could see. But as I stood there, watching Marcus laugh at something Natasha whispered in his ear, I'd felt something new crystallizing inside me. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that. Not just hurt, though my heart ached with betrayal. What I felt was clarity, sharp, bright, and absolutely certain. I'd spent years hiding my true background, downplaying my family's influence, pretending to be someone smaller than I was. I'd done it for noble reasons, believing that building something of my own required rejecting my family's power. But in that moment, I'd realized that false modesty wasn't virtue, it was just another form of hiding. I'd pulled out my phone and texted Vivienne, "Need to talk. Important. Meet me by the stage in 5." My cousin had appeared within 3 minutes, concern etching lines around her eyes. "What's wrong? Is it Marcus and that horrible woman?" "I need a favor," I'd said. "A big one, and I need you to trust me." Vivienne had studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Whatever you need." I'd outlined my plan quickly, watching her eyes widen with each detail. When I'd finished, she'd started laughing, not mocking laughter, but the delighted sound of someone recognizing poetic justice. "Oh, this is brilliant," she'd said. "Absolutely brilliant. When do you want to do it?" "During the auction preview, maximum audience." "Consider it done." The next 30 minutes had passed in a blur of preparation. I'd made several phone calls, pulled strings I hadn't pulled in years, and confirmed details I'd already suspected. My family's legal team was remarkably efficient when properly motivated, and the preliminary financial review I'd requested weeks ago, ostensibly to assess Marcus's company for potential investment, had revealed some very interesting irregularities. Nothing illegal, perhaps, but definitely questionable. Creative accounting, optimistic valuations, partnerships with individuals whose reputations wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. The kind of thing that could derail financing for a major project if the right people asked the right questions. I'd also made another call, this one to my sister Elizabeth, who managed our family foundation. What I'd proposed had made her gasp audibly. "Claire, that's a significant amount. Are you certain?" "Completely certain. Consider it an investment in my future." "Well, if you're sure, I'll authorize the transfer immediately." The foundation could use a high-profile donation, for tax purposes anyway. By the time the orchestra had paused, and the auctioneer had taken the stage to preview the evening's charity auction, I'd been ready. My hands had been steady, my breathing calm, my mind clear as ice. Vivienne had introduced the auction items, the Kehind Wiley sketch, a week at a villa in Tuscany, a private concert by a Grammy-winning cellist. The crowd had applauded politely, their attention divided between the stage and their own conversations. Marcus had still been on the dance floor with Natasha, barely paying attention to the program. That's when Vivienne had deviated from the script. "Before we begin bidding, I have a wonderful surprise," she'd announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "My dear cousin Claire Hartman would like to say a few words." Every eye in the room had turned toward me as I'd made my way to the stage. I'd seen Marcus finally look up, confusion crossing his face. Natasha had looked irritated at the interruption. I'd accepted the microphone from Vivienne, taking a moment to survey the crowd. 300 faces, many of them familiar from various society events over the years, though few had known my true identity. "Good evening, everyone," I'd begun, my voice steady and clear. "I apologize for the interruption, but I wanted to make a special announcement regarding tonight's cause." Marcus had started moving toward the stage, probably thinking I was going to embarrass myself, perhaps concerned I'd had too much champagne. As most of you know, I work as a curator at the Thornton Gallery in Chelsea. What many of you don't know is that I'm also a member of the Hartman family, as in Hartman International Hotel Group. The murmur that had rippled through the crowd had been deeply satisfying. I'd seen shock register on dozens of faces, including Marcus's, which had gone pale. I've kept that aspect of my background private because I wanted to build my career on my own merits. But tonight, for this incredibly important cause supporting arts education, I'd like to step forward in my full capacity. I'd paused for effect, making eye contact with Natasha, who had stopped mid-step toward the exit. On behalf of the Hartman Family Foundation, I'm pleased to announce a donation of $5 million to the Arts Education Initiative. The ballroom had erupted in applause and shocked exclamations. Phones had appeared immediately, people taking photos and videos, probably posting to social media about the unexpected revelation and generous donation. Vivienne had embraced me on stage, tears in her eyes, some genuine, some for show. "Claire, this is extraordinary, thank you so much." But I hadn't been finished. I gestured for the crowd to quiet down, my smile gracious, but with an edge that those paying close attention would have noticed. I'd also like to invite others to match this contribution if they're able. Natasha Sinclair, you mentioned earlier how passionate you are about arts education. Would you like to come up and announce your matching donation? The color had drained from Natasha's face. A matching donation of $5 million. She probably didn't have 500,000 in liquid assets. Every eye in the ballroom had turned toward her, waiting. She'd stammered something about needing to check with her financial advisor, her confidence evaporating like morning mist. I'd smiled sympathetically. Of course, I understand. It's a significant commitment. Perhaps a smaller contribution then. Natasha had practically fled the ballroom, her humiliation complete. But I still hadn't been done. I also wanted to share some exciting news about my husband's company, Hartman Development Group. I'd seen Marcus freeze, his face now showing genuine alarm. We've been conducting due diligence for a potential investment in his Long Island City waterfront project. Marcus had started shaking his head slightly, a silent plea for me to stop. Unfortunately, our legal and financial review has uncovered some concerns that will need to be addressed before any investment can proceed. Issues regarding partnership structures, valuation methodologies, and certain relationships that might pose reputational risks. The implication had been clear to everyone in the room. Marcus's project had problems, potentially serious ones. His credibility had just taken a massive hit in front of the very investors and bankers he'd been courting. I'd continued in that same pleasant, conversational tone, as if I were discussing the weather rather than systematically dismantling my husband's professional reputation. But I'm confident Marcus and I will work through these issues together. After all, marriage is about supporting each other through challenges, showing respect even when it's difficult, and never taking your partner for granted. Wouldn't you agree, darling? Marcus had looked like he might be sick. He'd pushed through the crowd toward the stage, reaching it just as I'd handed the microphone back to Vivienne. Claire, what the hell are you doing? He'd hissed under his breath. Making a donation to charity, I'd replied sweetly. You don't object to supporting arts education, do you? You know what I mean, the stuff about my company. Is absolutely true. Our legal team compiled quite a comprehensive report. We can discuss it in detail later. In private. The auctioneer had resumed the program, but I'd known no one was paying attention to the Kehind Wiley sketch anymore. The real drama was unfolding right in front of them, and it was far more entertaining than any charity auction. People had swarmed around me, gallery owners I'd worked with expressing shock at my family connection, socialites who'd never given me a second glance suddenly wanting to be my best friend, business contacts eager to discuss potential opportunities. My phone had started buzzing with texts and calls. Marcus had stood beside me, his expression shifting between embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been dawning realization. Several people had asked him about the Long Island City project, their questions carefully probing, clearly reconsidering their involvement based on my vague but damning comments. Through it all, I'd maintained perfect composure, gracious, friendly, giving no hint of the storm of emotions churning beneath my calm exterior. After about 20 minutes of being the center of attention, I gently extracted myself from the crowd and made my way toward the coat check. Marcus had followed me, catching my arm in the corridor outside the ballroom. Claire, we need to talk about this. Yes, we do, I'd agreed. But not here, not now. You just humiliated me in front of 300 people. The hypocrisy of that statement had almost made me laugh. I humiliated you. That's interesting, Marcus. Tell me, how do you think I felt watching you dance with your ex-girlfriend for 2 hours? while everyone in that room pitied me. That's different. How is it different? Natasha and I were just dancing. You made it sound like my company is some kind of fraud. I said there were concerns that needed to be addressed, which is true. The report from our legal team is quite detailed. I can email you a copy if you'd like to review it before we discuss further. Marcus had released my arm, running his hand through his hair in frustration. I can't believe you'd sabotage my business deal because you're jealous of Natasha. That word jealous had struck a nerve, and for the first time that evening, I'd let real anger seep into my— You're overreacting. Am I? Let me ask you something. If the situation were reversed, if I'd spent all night dancing with an ex-boyfriend, ignoring you, making you stand alone while people whispered about us, would you have been okay with that? He'd had no answer to that, his silence admission enough. I'd collected my coat from the check room attendant, wrapping it around my shoulders. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. I'm leaving. You can stay and continue catching up with Natasha if you'd like, or you can come home. But either way, we're going to have a serious conversation about our marriage. Claire, come on, don't make this into some big dramatic thing. I turned to face him fully, and whatever he'd seen in my expression had made him take a step back. You made it dramatic when you chose to prioritize your ex-girlfriend over your wife at a public event. I'm simply responding with the same level of investment you showed in our marriage tonight. What do you want from me? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. Can we just go home and forget about this? Forget about it. Marcus, do you understand what just happened in there? I revealed my family background, which I've kept private for years, specifically to make a point. I donated $5 million. $5 million that could have gone toward a dozen other things. It's my family's money, Marcus. Not yours, and I chose to invest it in something I believe in, just like you chose to invest your evening in Natasha. The reality of the situation had finally seemed to penetrate his anger. I'd watched comprehension dawn on his face, the realization that I'd just demonstrated exactly how much power I'd been sitting on all along, power I could have used to advance his career, his projects, his ambitions, if only he'd valued me enough to treat me with basic respect. The donation was brilliant, he'd said slowly. From a business perspective, the publicity alone. This wasn't a business decision, this was personal. Okay, I messed up tonight, I admit it, but blowing up my deal with those investors. That's going too far. I'd started walking toward the exit, my heels clicking on the marble floor. Over my shoulder, I'd said, I didn't blow up anything that wasn't already problematic. You might want to review those partnerships with Boris Volkov and the Three Rivers Group. Their reputations aren't exactly pristine, and any legitimate investor would have caught those issues eventually. Marcus had gone very still. How do you know about Volkov and Three Rivers? Due diligence, darling. It's what responsible investors do before committing capital. Your company applied for investment from our family office 3 weeks ago, remember? Did you think we wouldn't look into every detail? I'd actually been the one to suggest Marcus apply to the Hartman family office for financing, seeing it as a way to help his business while keeping everything in the family. But the preliminary review had revealed enough red flags that I'd quietly shelved the investment without telling him. Until tonight, I'd planned to give him a chance to clean up those partnerships before raising the issues. But that was before he'd spent an evening publicly disrespecting me. Marcus had caught up to me at the hotel entrance, where a line of town cars waited to collect departing guests. Claire, please, can we talk about this at home? I'd looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. When had my husband become someone who'd prioritize nostalgia and ego over respect for our marriage? Or had he always been this person, and I'd simply been too busy building my own life to notice? Yes, we'll talk at home, I'd agreed. But Marcus, you need to understand something. Tonight wasn't about punishing you, though I won't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in it. Tonight was about reminding you, and maybe reminding myself, who I actually am. A Hartman, he'd said quietly. Yes, a Hartman. But more than that, I'm a woman who has built a successful career in a competitive field through her own talent and hard work. I'm someone who has chosen to live modestly not because I had to, but because I wanted to prove myself independent of my family name. I'm your wife, and I deserved better than what you gave me tonight." The valet had brought around a town car, and I'd slid into the back seat before Marcus could respond. Through the window, I'd seen him standing on the curb, his expression a complicated mix of anger, shame, and what might have been the first stirrings of genuine regret. My phone had buzzed continuously during the ride home, texts from Vivienne praising my performance, messages from colleagues who'd had no idea about my family background, even a few. The brownstone had been dark and quiet when I'd arrived home. I'd kicked off my heels in the entryway, poured myself a glass of wine, and curled up on the sofa in the living room, still wearing my midnight blue gown. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the evening had begun to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion and something deeper, a profound sadness that my marriage had reached this point. I'd loved Marcus. Maybe I still did. But love without respect was just a pretty word for slowly drowning while pretending everything was fine. He'd arrived home about an hour later, finding me still on the sofa, now on my second glass of wine. He'd sat in the chair across from me, his bow tie undone, his expression subdued. "You left quite an impression," he'd said. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Half the people are congratulating me on marrying into the Hartman family. The other half are questioning my business practices. Both groups probably should have been paying attention sooner." Fair point. He'd been quiet for a moment then. "I really am sorry, Claire. Not just because of the fallout, but because I hurt you. I wasn't thinking about how it looked, how it felt for you. Natasha was flattering me, making me feel important, successful. It felt good to be the center of someone's attention like that. Instead of being the center of your wife's attention. You're always working, always focused on the gallery, your exhibitions, your artists. Sometimes I feel like I'm just there. In the background of your life." That had stung because there was truth in it. I had been focused on my career, perhaps to the exclusion of nurturing our relationship. But that didn't excuse what he'd done. "So your solution was to seek attention from your ex-girlfriend at a public event. That's your defense." "It's not a defense. It's an explanation. I'm not defending what I did. It was disrespectful and stupid. But our marriage hasn't been great for a while now, Claire. You have to admit that." I'd set down my wine glass, considering his words carefully. "You're right. We've been coasting, going through the motions. And I bear responsibility for that too. But Marcus, if you were unhappy, if you felt neglected, the answer was to talk to me about it. Not to publicly humiliate me while seeking validation from another woman." I know. "God, Claire, I've really screwed this up, haven't I?" "Yes, you have. Is there any way to fix it? Or did you just blow up our marriage along with my business deal?" That question had hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Could we fix this? Did I even want to? "I don't know," I'd answered honestly. "I think we need help, professional help. Marriage counseling, someone who can help us figure out if what we have is worth saving or if we're just prolonging the inevitable." "I don't want to lose you." "Then you need to show me that through actions, not words. You need to be willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust, of treating me with the respect I deserve. And I need to be willing to be more present in this marriage, more attentive to your needs. What about the stuff with my company? Can you, walk back those comments?" I'd looked at him steadily. "No, because they're true. Marcus, you need to clean up those partnerships. Volkov has ties to questionable Russian interests. Three Rivers Group has been investigated twice for money laundering. Even if the investigations didn't result in charges, the association alone makes investors nervous." "How do you know all this?" "Because when the Hartman family office considers an investment, we don't just look at financial statements. We look at everything. And what we found in your company was concerning enough that I couldn't in good conscience recommend the investment to my father." Marcus had slumped in his chair, the weight of his mistakes, professional and personal, settling on his shoulders. "So what now? Now you decide what matters more, salvaging those partnerships or salvaging our marriage. Because I won't be married to someone whose business practices are questionable, regardless of whether they're technically legal. My family's reputation means something, and by extension, so does mine." "That's not fair. You hid your family connection from me." "I didn't hide it. You knew who my family was before we got married. I just didn't advertise it because I wanted to build my own life. There's a difference. But you had all this power, all these resources, and you never what? Never used them to advance your career. Never opened doors for you. Marcus, I introduced you to dozens of valuable contacts. I've supported your projects. But I wasn't going to compromise my family's business standards just to help you close a deal. He'd had no response to that, and we'd sat in silence for several long minutes. Finally, I'd said, "Here's my offer. We start marriage counseling. You clean up your business partnerships. You show me, through consistent action over time, that you value me and our marriage. If you can do those things, maybe we can rebuild what we've lost. And if I can't, or if it's not enough." I'd met his gaze directly. "Then we end this cleanly. No drama, no fighting over assets. I'll make sure you're treated fairly in the settlement, but I won't stay in a marriage where I'm not valued and respected." Marcus had nodded slowly, processing the ultimatum I'd just delivered. "When you revealed your family connection tonight, made that donation, called out Natasha, that was you taking your power back." Yes. It was impressive. Terrifying but impressive. I spent years making myself smaller, quieter, less threatening. I thought that's what it meant to be independent, to prove myself. But tonight, I realized that real strength isn't about hiding who you are. It's about owning it fully and using it wisely. He'd stood up, crossing to where I sat on the sofa. For a moment, I'd thought he might try to kiss me, but instead, he'd simply taken my hand. "I don't want to lose you, Claire. I'll do whatever it takes. The counseling, cleaning up the business, all of it, just, please give me a chance to make this right." I'd squeezed his hand, wanting to believe him but knowing that words were easy. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, in whether his actions matched his promises. "We'll see," I'd said, which was the most hope I could offer in that moment. The next morning, I'd woken to find Marcus already up, coffee made, breakfast prepared, a small gesture, but more than he'd done in months. My phone had shown 73 new messages, including several from journalists wanting to interview me about the donation and the revelation of my family background. There'd also been a message from my father. "Heard about last night. Well played, call me when you can." Vivienne had texted, "The gala raised $2 million total, partially thanks to your donation inspiring others. Also, everyone is still talking about your performance. You're officially a legend." And from Natasha Sinclair, received at 3:47 a.m., "You didn't have to humiliate me like that. I was just dancing with an old friend." I deleted that last message without responding. Natasha had made her choices, and now she'd live with the consequences, just as Marcus and I would live with ours. In my office at the gallery that Monday, I'd sat across from my assistant director, explaining that yes, I was indeed a member of the Hartman Hotel family, and no, it didn't change anything about my role at the gallery or my commitment to my work. If anything, the revelation had brought new opportunities. Collectors who'd previously overlooked our modest gallery were suddenly interested in exhibitions. Donors were calling with offers of support. But the real change wasn't external. It was internal, a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I'd spent years proving I could succeed without my family's name, and I had. The gallery's success was mine, earned through expertise and hard work. But denying my family connection had. Now I could be both. Claire Hartman, the accomplished curator, and Claire Hartman of the Hartman International Hotel Group. Not one or the other, but fully integrated, completely myself. Marcus and I had started counseling the following week. It was uncomfortable, difficult, sometimes painful. Our therapist had made us confront the ways we'd both failed each other, his need for external validation, my tendency to emotionally withdraw, the patterns of communication breakdown that had been building for years. He'd also begun the process of extricating himself from the problematic business partnerships, though it was costing him significantly in the short term. The Long Island City project had stalled as new investors conducted their own due diligence and came to the same conclusions my family's team had reached. "I'm going to have to start over," he'd told me one evening, about 3 weeks after the gala. "Rebuild the deal from scratch with clean partners." "That's probably for the best," I'd said. "Better to build something solid than to rush into something that could collapse later. I hate that you were right about Volkov and Three Rivers. I hate that I had to be right about it." We'd shared a rueful smile, one of the first genuine moments of connection since that disastrous night. The path forward wasn't clear, and I couldn't say with certainty that our marriage would survive. But I'd learned something crucial that night at Vivienne's gala. Standing on that stage in front of 300 witnesses, I didn't need to make myself smaller to be loved. I didn't need to hide my power to be valued. And I would never again tolerate being disrespected by my husband or anyone else. As I sat in my office now, 3 months after that transformative evening, reviewing proposals for the gallery's spring exhibition, my phone rang. It was my sister Elizabeth. "Claire, I have news. The foundation wants to create an annual arts education award in your name, recognizing your donation. They're calling it the Claire Hartman Excellence in Arts Education Grant." I'd felt unexpected tears prick my eyes. Not because of the recognition, though that was meaningful, but because I'd finally stopped being afraid of being seen. The woman who'd hidden her identity for so long was gone, replaced by someone who owned every part of her story. The privilege she'd been born into, and the success she'd earned independently, the mistakes she'd made, and the wisdom she'd gained. "That sounds wonderful, Elizabeth, thank you." After I'd hung up, I'd pulled up the photo from the gala that had made the rounds on social media. Me on stage, microphone in hand, midnight blue gown catching the light, face composed but determined. The caption on the society page had read, "Claire Hartman makes surprise appearance and donation." But to me, it was something else entirely. It was the moment I'd stopped apologizing for being powerful. The moment I demanded the respect I deserved. The moment I'd realized that sometimes, the best revenge isn't about hurting someone else. It's about finally, fully becoming yourself. Marcus and I were still in counseling, still working through our issues, the outcome uncertain. But whatever happened with our marriage, I knew I'd never again stand silently by while someone treated me as less than I was. I'd spent too many years hiding my light, and I was done with that version of myself. The woman in that photograph, confident, powerful, unafraid, that was who I'd always been underneath. It had just taken a night of public humiliation and a $5 million donation to remember it. And honestly, it was worth every penny.